So where does Rancé begin in the second volume of his On the Holiness and Duty of the Monastic Life, concerned with exterior penance? He starts, of course, with a description, a rather idyllic description, of the cloister, of the monastery. It is, in one sense, the monk's home. It is, in another sense, as I said before, the monk's tomb. That's where monks go to die, to imitate their master who died. Do corpses, and so do monks, should monks leave the monastery? No, they should not. Rancé is insistent upon stabilitas, upon stability. Once you're in the monastery, you don't go out. And you don't go out for any reason. And all sorts of examples coming, I may say, right down to the modern, certainly in the 20th century, probably in the 21st century, Cistercian tradition of superiors not permitting monks or nuns to go out for funerals of parents. There have been examples of, and you know better than I. I only know it by rumour, but I certainly know it in Rancé's case that no, they don't go out of the monastery. He says, do corpses normally leave their tombs? No, they do not. So where you're in your tomb, once you're in your tomb, you stay in your tomb. That's what you come here for. And that's what they did. They were some people, of course, couldn't take it. Some people, of course, just couldn't take it at all, and they left. Their constitutions were unable to take the privations in food, in the hard labour, more about that in a minute, in the obedience, and so on and so on and so on. Of course, some people couldn't take it, just as now some people can't take it. And the very careful observation of postulancy and novitiate and all the rest of it nowadays, which we observer and postulants, that was not the case in Rancé's time. So, of course, many came in, but few were chosen. That's understandable. So, no, you don't, in fact, leave the monastery. We don't give ourselves a break, for example, and we don't leave it to engage in lawsuits. He is absolutely insistent on that. If, for example, you belong to a noble family, and many of those who came to Trappe did, and there are legal problems in the family, do you go out to deal with them? No, you do not. He has no time for legal problems. No, you leave that to the lawyers. It has nothing to do with you whatsoever. You don't go out of the monastery. And he devotes a long section, 7 whole pages, where he quotes St. Francis de Sales on exactly this point. And we'll have to remember here, by the way, that 17th century France was a remarkably litigious society. People would go to law over the slightest thing. Lawyers did extremely well. Lawsuits were everywhere. And La Trappe itself became involved in a number of lawsuits, which Rancé would have no time whatsoever and would not involve himself in at all in any way. So no, you don't go out. No, not at all. Health of parents? No. You don't go out, etc., etc. He then follows this by a chapter on the silence of La Trappe. This, of course, is another outward view of penitence. And the silence at La Trappe was far, as those of you know who I'm talking now, who were brought up, who were introduced into the Cistercian way in the very early days of before, say, the Second Vatican Council. The silence was far stricter than it is now. When sign language is still being used, it is a little bit, but when sign language is the standard, and we have in fact examples written in the 18th century, in the 17th or certainly the 18th century, of the sign language being used at La Trappe, and that was discouraged too, because sign language is simply talking. It just doesn't make noise, that's all. But the silence at La Trappe, the great silence, was something that fascinated the outside observers, and they wanted to come and experience what it was like, because remember too, La Trappe was in the wilds of Normandy, the real wilds of Normandy, and the only thing you heard once you found the place was the sounds of nature. The sounds of nature, and then, of course, the chanting of the monks in the offices. But other than that, there was absolute complete, total silence. Why? Rancé is quite clear. If you're chattering away in your mind, you can't hear the voice of God. Silence is a basis for God to talk to you. And he quotes Saint Arsenius the Great, that when Arsenius was asked on one occasion why he did not encourage visitors of any sort whatsoever, one of the Desert Fathers, of course, he replied that he could not talk to God and people at the same time. So, didn't want anybody there in order to talk to God. And Rancé says the practice of silence is a practice that sanctifies the whole Cistercian order. But that was the strict silence of La Trappe. Now, there were, however, conferences, which was when Rancé would gather his monks together, sometimes in the chapter room, sometimes outside in the woods, and they would gather together, and the conference was really a discussion by monks of a particular theological point, not a point of theological pickiness like the doctrine of the Trinity or the procession of the Holy Spirit, but something, as Rancé says, which was, say, a sentence found in Gregory the Great, or a sentence found in Cassian, or a sentence found in Basil, or a sentence found in John of the Ladder, which would then form a basis for informed discussion, informed exchange of opinion. And he would guide the conferences, but the conferences were important. It gave the monks a chance to express themselves. It gave Rancé a chance to see how they had progressed in their spiritual development. It gave the monks a chance to show their courtesy to one another by not saying, that was the most unspeakably stupid comment that I've ever heard, this sort of thing. So it showed them how to be polite to each other, to show that fraternal charity, which is so important. But in fact, Rancé found them useful, but they had to be controlled. Had to be very carefully controlled, both in length of time and in topic. Not a question for theological discussion, but a question for transformation, not information. But generally speaking, at La Trappe, silence was the rule. He then goes on to talk about the rule itself. And he asks the question, as I said earlier, whether there are times when the rule itself, which demands silence, are there times when the rule can be relaxed? Are there times for this? Are there times when the rule perhaps needs to be changed because of changing circumstances? Well, he says, the rule of St. Benedict is a wonderful rule, but, I quote him, there are times when it not only can, but should be dispensed with, if the regulations laid down by the saints for the edification of the Church, the maintenance of discipline, and the preservation of good morals produce the opposite effects, they no longer have authority and no longer should be heeded. And he says if St. Benedict himself were alive at this time, he would see to what extent his instructions had been abused, but he'd also see, because of changing times, that there were certain areas in which they might profitably be amended. And I'll talk about that a little more in a later conference. He moves on then from silence and the possibility of the rule being amended to discuss the question of manual labour. There's a whole chapter on manual labour. And he says, this is an imitation of Christ too, because what was Jesus of Nazareth as a young man? He worked as a carpenter. And therefore we are imitating Christ, the carpenter of Nazareth, in our manual labour. Furthermore, in manual labour, which involves the tilling of the fields, the preparation of our own resources, the preparation of vegetables, etc., 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 we are not dependent upon the outside world for our existence. We want to be, as far as possible, totally, completely self-sufficient. Those cloister walls are barriers. Nowadays, we tend to look for ways to, or most of us do, tend to look for ways for breaking down barriers. Rancé was looking for ways to set them up. He wanted no contact between the world and the cloister, inside and outside the cloister walls. Once the monks were inside, they didn't go outside, and those who were outside were, if they wished, welcome to visitors because of the demand for hospitality, which is really important at La Trappe. But those walls were big, solid walls. They wanted to be self-sufficient communities. Furthermore, more than that, manual labour, which is insisted on in the rule of St. Benedict and which had slid away in many of the other communities, was an excellent exercise in humility. An excellent exercise in humility. And again, Rancé introduces a whole wealth of sources to support what he says and how important it is to labour with one's hands. And he disagrees on this score. He disagrees sometimes to some extent with Mabillon, saying that manual labour. It's not the case that manual labour takes away from one's time of prayer. Manual labour does not take away from one's time of study. Manual labour does not take away from one's devotion. Why not? Because of prayer in action. The manual labour is in itself, if it's done for the sake of God and with God in mind, is itself a form of prayer. Now he says, it can't therefore be the sort of manual labour which demands too much attention. When the Desert Fathers, for example, one of the things that the Desert Fathers used to do for manual labour was to weave baskets, as you all know, because the weaving of baskets is kind of like the making of candy. There's a certain repetitiveness about it, and while you're weaving your basket, you can in fact ponder God, you can think, you can meditate on God's side. But even so, the weaving of the basket itself is an art, is a form of prayer. Sometimes you can get out of hand. There's a story of he quotes one of the stories of one of the Desert Fathers who was weaving his basket, and thinking about God, and then found that he'd weaved 2 or 3 baskets all together, and then had to unpluck them all again. Sometimes, however, in modern terms, if you're dealing with, say, if we had monks dealing with setting up new computer programs, this would not be so good, because this demands the full 100%, complete attention, and that would be perhaps a little bit too much. So he says you have to be a little careful about the sort of manual labour which you're doing. He says that quite clearly. But apart from that, manual labour is, as I said, and it can be a very necessary, a very real mode of prayer in itself. If you prepare the food the community needs, says Rancé, if you do your own laundry, if you clean your own stables, if you carry manure, if you dig the ground, cultivate your vegetable gardens yourselves, carefully and fervently, so they become your main source of food. If you make your own clothes, if you make your own window panes, he actually uses that term, if you make your own spoons and baskets and shoes and such like, without having recourse to outside craftsmen, in short, if you neglect none of the services you can render to the monastery and joyfully embrace the meanest and most contemptible occupations, this is an advantage to you, and it is an advantage to your monastery, and it is a demonstration not only of your love for God, your imitation of Christ, who worked for his living, imitation of St. Paul, who worked for his living as a tent maker, but it is of great benefit to your neighbour as well. Manual labour is essential, absolutely essential. And this was one of the big controversies too with the common observance at the time, who had tended to reduce it to give time for more work time in church. There then follows a brief chapter on vigils. And in Rancé's time, the night office, vigils in the night office, was very much longer than it is nowadays in any Cistercian monastery. It went on for a very long time, sometimes 2.5 hours, and just on and on and on. And but he says, nevertheless, it has great advantages. What's it do? Well, it reduces the need for sleep, which is a waste of time as far as he's concerned. And sleep, in the view of the ancient solitaries, the fathers of the desert, was to be acquainted with real degradation. And why? I quote Rancé, because in sleep the actions of the spirit cease, and while they are suspended, we lose our human nobility and excellence and become just like other animals over which God has given us such great advantages. So the less sleep, the better. And as you can understand, compared with a proteinless diet and all the rest of it, this is not good for the constitution. Furthermore, vigils, he said, and I will quote, they do away with vain thoughts, night offices, night watches, do away with vain thoughts, and they do away with temptations brought about by dreams, those wicked dreams on which Cassian spends an entire conference. They mortify the body, they cool the heat of concupiscence, they expel nightmares, they induce penitential tears, they soften the heart, they clarify our mind. And he's quoting. And who's he quoting? He's quoting St. John of the Ladder. That's whom he's quoting. It's a short chapter on vigils. And then he moves on to a much longer chapter on poverty, on which I don't really need to say very much at all. It is not, as you know, essentially poverty of wealth, poverty of riches, poverty of buildings, but poverty of spirit. That's the essential thing. And the essential thing beneath that is the eradication of self-love, self-will, the separation of oneself, the detachment of oneself from the world, which is the essential feature of Rancé's monasticism. But it leads also to our respect for the poor. We are poor as monks, but that poverty is everywhere, as it was in 17th century France, still is for that matter. But 17th century France was a very rigidly and highly stratified society. There were the nobility, there was the clergy, and there was effectively the peasantry. And at the bottom of the peasantry were the peasants. And these are days when we have no unemployment assistance, when we have the state does not provide anything at all. If you're a peasant who was starving, you starved and you died, and that's all there was to it. So La Trappe and the other monasteries, especially this monastery of the strict observance who accepted the reform of Rancé, treated hospitality with extreme seriousness. And we know from abbeys which were under the common observance and which didn't have a particularly good reputation, the Abbey of Pontigny, for example, the great Abbey of Pontigny in France, we know how much they were giving out in bread in the 18th century, before the French Revolution. Huge amount to the people who were coming there. We also know that when La Trappe, long after the death of Rancé, 80-90 years after the death of Rancé, when La Trappe was threatened with closure in the early stage of the French Revolution, there were petitions from the local people, the local peasantry, to keep the abbey open because of what the abbey was providing in food and drink for the surrounding peoples. Furthermore, the abbey was also, La Trappe was also providing medical care for the poor and the rustics of the surrounding region. I mean, La Trappe is by definition a wild and out-of-the-way place. Physicians were not there, and in any case, the poor could not possibly afford to pay for medical services. So we know that at Trappe there was, in fact, this is after Rancé, but we know that there was an interior and an exterior pharmacy. The interior pharmacy to deal with the monks who were seriously ill, and the exterior pharmacy to deal with the local population. And it may be of interest to you to know that in the exterior pharmacy we have a book list from after Rancé. This is true, it's after Rancé, but we have an 18th century book list from which lists the books in the exterior pharmacy, and part of those books were the normal books for surgery, for medicine and everything else, but they included a series of up-to-date volumes on gynecology, midwifery, accouchements and births. And there's no doubt that women from the surrounding countryside, when they were having difficulties with births, were actually coming to the Trappe and being treated by monk physicians for women's complaints. Just astonishing. But there were strong petitions, really major petitions, to keep the abbey open because of the hospitality which it was offering. And Rancé insists on this in his De la Sainteté, the importance, the absolute essential importance of hospitality. The poor must be dealt with. Okay, you have them with you always. I mean, you do not have always, but they must be looked after. It's our responsibility. Why? Because they are our neighbours, set before us in the place of God. And that's how we show to them what God himself does not need, but needs in them. And he spends quite some time stressing the great importance of hospitality to the poor. He ends his second volume with a long chapter on mitigations. You know, when can the rule be changed? When is it possible to do this? And effectively he says never. He has no time for mitigations and for dispensing with the rule. But there are limits to this. It sounds as if at the moment I'm saying what Rancé says is the rule rules. The rule cannot be changed. The rule must not be changed. What it says in the rule of St. Benedict holds. Keep the letter of the law. Do nothing else which will challenge it. Even though we've seen earlier, just a few moments ago, that he says, if a superior commands you to do something which is clearly contrary to the rule, you have the right to refuse it. But it's still, when he's saying, keep the rule, do the rule, mitigations are wrong, dispensations are wrong, it still sounds that we say the rule above all, keep the letter of the law. This is not the case, as you will discover in the next conference.